And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. I am Ari Melber. Rachel has the night off. We are in a breaking news Friday. In the last few hours, we've gotten a ruling from the Supreme Court on Trump seizing funds for part of the border wall. It's not a full victory for this administration, but it does reopen a door, and we have more on that later. Plus, Donald Trump using executive power to undercut science. This is a story you may not have heard about anywhere else today. The reporter who broke it will join us live this hour. So we have all of that, but we begin on Capitol Hill, where there are actually new steps towards an impeachment probe. Now, that is not what the conventional wisdom held would happen when Special Counsel Robert Mueller finished testifying Wednesday. But now, as the week ends, the number of Democratic members of Congress backing an impeachment probe has grown. As the chairman who would lead any such probe, Jerry Nadler, is now formally invoking the I word in a new court filing. Now, here's the count. 5 House Democrats have now stepped out in favor of an impeachment inquiry, including Congresswoman Kathleen Clark of Massachusetts, a member of the House leadership, also the highest-ranking Democrat to publicly take this stance. Then you have 3 more House Democrats today announcing support for an impeachment inquiry: Annie Kuster, Chris Pappas of New Hampshire, and Mike Levin of California. So you take that together, and now you have about 100 Democrats backing some kind of impeachment probe. That is the raw tally, the political nose-counting context of this. And for the House Democrats, though, that's not all, because there is a new legal move today as they try to pry more evidence loose from the White House and the Justice Department, taking their case to court to get redacted grand jury material. This is the stuff that actually informed the grist of the narratives in the Mueller report, and it picks up the fight over the very ways that Attorney General Barr held back parts of this report. We all remember the redactions, and he did allow members of Congress to see behind some of these redacted pages. So members of Congress have already seen more than, say, average citizens. But Mr. Barr never let anyone see the grand jury information. And while this material is generally restricted from the public, it's not always restricted, as I mentioned, from these members of Congress. You can just think about recent history. Republicans welcomed it, that same kind of grand jury material, when Ken Starr handed over not only a report, but all his grand jury material. No redactions, no delays that time. So now you have House Democrats insisting they need the same type of material for their work right now as a co-equal branch of government. And this is not a theoretical debate at this point. This is the basis for the hardball of holding Mr. Barr in contempt, and now in this legal case in today's court filing. Democrats pressing they must get the material so they can properly carry out their investigations of the president and his campaign.
You also described in your report that the then Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, shared with a Russian operative, Kilimnik, the campaign strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states and internal polling data of the campaign. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Did your investigation determine who requested the polling data to be shared with Kilimnik?
Well, I would direct you to the report and adopt what we have in the report with regard to that particular issue.
We don't have the redacted version. That's maybe another reason why we should get that for Volume 1.
We don't have the redacted version. Maybe we should get that. Because in the report, or the version that Congress got and that we have seen publicly, there is information potentially revealing who it was that requested Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort share this prized internal polling data with this Russian operative, and perhaps why, because you see there, we know what was alluded to, but it is redacted. As you see on your screen, the reason it was redacted is because of grand jury material. Now, in the court filing today, the House Judiciary Committee argues there are several episodes described in the Mueller report that have this kind of information redacted, and the committee needs it. They need it because the DOJ will not allow prosecution of a sitting president. And they explain the House is the only institution of the federal government that can now hold President Trump accountable for these actions. They also point to the planned questioning of former White House counsel Don McGahn, the star witness of the obstruction portion of the Mueller report, cited over 150 times. House Judiciary making the case that if there is grand jury testimony about the president's knowledge of these events and how his campaign approached all of it, that would shed light on what the president might have been trying to cover up with his repeated attempts to, of course, interfere with and obstruct the Mueller investigation. Those attempts made, yes, back through Mr. McGahn. Now, his testimony has been blocked by the White House. Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler announcing today compelling McGahn's testimony is the next legal battle. So all of that together is the what, the evidence. And in court, more than in politics, it's not just the what, it's the why. Why do you get typically secret evidence? What is the authority? Where in law or the Constitution does it give Congress this kind of power? And is it so clear that a judge can then order around the DOJ or the White House to provide it? And this is a really interesting part today, the why. Because in this potentially, arcane legal brief, the why went off like a rocket today. The why is the impeachment power, which is in the Constitution. It's one of Congress's greatest potential powers, right up there with making war or taxes, which are two other things, by the way, the founders put mostly in Congress's hands. So you have the Democrats' brief today stating clearly the House must have access to all the relevant facts and consider whether to exercise its full Article I powers, including a constitutional power of the utmost gravity, approval of articles of impeachment. There's that word. And in this new filing, the committee argues here, basically for the first time, it is entitled to the grand jury materials under this very specific exception to grand jury secrecy. This court authorized to disclose these materials because the committee seeks to use them preliminarily or in connection with a judicial proceeding, the committee investigating whether to recommend articles of impeachment. And this why argument explains Congress has a stronger hand when demanding information when it has a committee that seeks to use that very information linked to a judicial proceeding. The committee here conducting this investigation. So this is crucial. This is not an aside. This is not a throw every reference at the wall kind of argument. This is not, we really want this stuff. Let's mention any potential maybe rationales in, a footnote or oral argument in the court. This is now, today, for the first time, the core of what the House says it's doing. We could put these headers back up, and you'll see from the new filing, an investigation regarding impeachment is preliminary to judicial proceeding, the Democrats say. Or this other heading, the Judiciary Committee is investigating whether to recommend articles of impeachment. And just to drive the point home, they even quote the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee in 1974, writing to the judge to request grand jury materials related to the Watergate burglary, and the judge's 74 order releasing grand jury material. As a strategy, this whole option has long been available. And that's known not only to lawyers or Watergate experts, it's probably known to you as a news consumer. Rachel, right here, has reported on how the best legal argument for getting this grand jury material is for Democrats to establish they're in the turf, in the ambit of a judicial proceeding, a.k.a. an impeachment probe. Now, this is still a summer Friday. Congress is still giving itself a 6 weeks recess. And let's be honest, this isn't maybe the typical way that political parties do announce a formal impeachment probe, especially with a speaker who keeps tamping down expectations for all of this. So, what is this? Is this a step towards an impeachment probe or a pre-impeachment strategy or some kind of on-ramp to impeachment? Is impeachment a spectrum? Well, the explanations at today's Judiciary Committee press conference sort of ranged.
Given what you've said about this filing, comments that you've made in hearings in recent weeks, are you all beginning to shade into an impeachment inquiry, even if you haven't held the formal vote of the House? Is that what's going on here?
What's going on?
Smart boy. We don't need it.
What's going on is that I think too much has been made of the phrase an impeachment inquiry. Now, you may want to call that an inquiry or not. Now, whether you call that an inquiry or whatever you want to call that, that's what we've been doing and we are doing and will continue to do.
You're saying there's no difference between what you're doing now and an impeachment inquiry, correct?
In effect.
A lot of people believe we've been in an impeachment inquiry ever since we started looking into potential high crimes and misdemeanors and the misconduct of the executive branch. Other people think an impeachment inquiry doesn't begin until you actually have articles of impeachment. I would say we are in an impeachment investigation.
Going to court today, is this an escalation in your investigation?
It's the next step in our investigation, and yes. I don't know if you call it an escalation.
We are now officially entering into an examination of whether or not to recommend the articles of impeachment. So we have crossed a threshold. I just wanted to make that real clear.
Do you believe President Trump will ultimately leave office being impeached by this House, regardless of timeline?
I don't know.
Thank you very much.
You have a momentous briefing there ending with that shrug and the chairman walking off stage. And one way to look at it is it's vividly honest. You ask him, what is this? He says, call it what you want. You ask him, well, what will it lead to? And he says, I don't know. Are there more answers here? Well, we have an extraordinary guest right now to help understand what this Judiciary Committee is doing right now and why it might matter regardless of what it's called. Jamie Raskin, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, is here on the Rachel Maddow Show. Thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be with you, Ari.
Is this an impeachment probe?
Sure. We were just confronted with overwhelming evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors, 10 episodes of obstruction of justice, a presidential candidate in his campaign welcoming with open arms foreign interference in our presidential election. If Bill Clinton can be impeached for telling one lie about sex, that's low crimes and misdemeanors. This is in the category of high crimes and misdemeanors. And we're investigating it, and we're trying to figure out whether these are high crimes and misdemeanors that justify impeachment. But I would say that our investigative future involves a lot of other issues. I think the American public has the sense that money is really at the heart of the Trump White House, and he has essentially converted the presidency into an instrument of self-enrichment, a money-making enterprise basically for himself and his business and his friends. And that's what the whole federal government has turned into. And so we need to investigate whether the Foreign Emoluments Clause, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, has been violated and is being violated every day. There have been reports that 24 different foreign governments have basically been filling Donald Trump's pockets through the Trump Hotel, through the office tower, through the golf courses. There's the Domestic Emoluments Clause, which says that he's limited to receiving his salary. We can't increase it. We can't decrease it. And yet every time they go to Mar-a-Lago, for example, they're spending $75,000 or $100,000 that goes directly from federal government agencies and departments to the Trump Hotel. So that, I would say, should be the beginning of following the money. But we remember that Donald Trump said that he would basically blow up the special counsel investigation if they looked at his finances. He's not going to be able to hamstring the U.S. Congress in the same way. We're going to get to the bottom of all of it.
Do you think there's a high crime that the president obstructed justice?
Was certainly multiple times. Each one of those episodes described.
So if that's the case, let me press you on that, because I think everything you just laid out, viewers would say, yeah, that sounds bad, and certainly in the Congress's ambit to do something about it. But why would that require any further delay? There is a concern that the Democratic Party in the House talked a lot about waiting for things, waiting for Mueller to finish, then waiting to get the report, then waiting to get Mueller to testify. We are now past all of that, and so a conversation about the Trump Hotel or, legitimate concerns about constitutional limits on foreign bribes makes sense, but not necessarily as a reason to wait further to deal with whether or not there's consequences for what you define as obstruction.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about waiting. I'm talking about aggressively accelerating our investigation into all of the corruption and criminality that pervade the White House and the executive branch of government. I mean, most people understand, despite Donald Trump being able to gerrymander the subject matter of the Mueller investigation, that all of that started because Donald Trump wanted to build make $1 billion deal for Trump Tower in Moscow, and meantime was collecting money that was being laundered from Russian oligarchs through the hotels and through the various businesses. That was the genesis of the relationship with the Russians. It was not a political conspiracy, as Mueller found. Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence did not need Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump to execute their plot against America. They just used the Trumps, but they didn't conspire with the Trumps to make it happen. Unfortunately, the Trumps never called the FBI. They just said, come on in and, find the emails and dump the WikiLeaks and so on. But Look, money was at the heart of it, and money continues to be at the heart of it. And there's a very important constitutional principle here. Our founders wanted the President of the United States and every member of Congress to be 100% devoted to the public interest of the American people and not to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and Azerbaijan and Turkey and any government that comes over that decides to fill the president's coffers. And the presidency is not supposed to be a money-making operation. We've got to vindicate that principle, but I agree with you, we've got to do it quickly.
Did you learn anything from Bob Mueller's testimony that was not in the Mueller report?
No. Everything, I read the Mueller report, I think, 3 or 4 different times, and he stuck extremely closely to the text. I think he opened up a bit in the afternoon when he was willing to say that all of the president's conduct was unpatriotic and unethical and immoral. There he strayed, a couple of feet beyond the 4 corners of the text. But basically, what he recited to us and confirmed for us were all of these episodes of obstruction of justice with Michael Cohen, where they called him up to try to butter him up to say, stay on the team, stick to the party line. And when he decided he couldn't lie anymore, he spilled his guts and told the truth about Donald Trump and the payoffs to Stormy Daniels and so on. At that point, they turned on him and, Trump basically threatened to drop a dime on him, saying, we know about your father-in-law and we know about this member of your family and that member of your family. If the president's got evidence of criminality among his staff or friends, he should turn it over to the FBI and not hold it in store as a form of leverage against them to keep them from testifying against him. That's what mob bosses do.
Congressman Jamie Raskin from the House Judiciary Committee on a night when you've been busy and making news. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for following the story, and I hope everybody out there gets some comfort that in the Article 1 branch, we are zealously going to uphold and defend the Constitution.
You heard it here, and I wish you a good evening as well. Let me tell you what else we have in store tonight. The Democrats are looking at this as a court battle. We have some experts on how it's really going to go down. Later, as mentioned, this breaking news late on a Friday about the border wall from the Supreme Court. We have that. A lot to get to on this very busy evening. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.